Welcome to the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. I am the sports editor at the Herald Democrat, Jason Della, Rosa, and we are in the middle of the high school football playoffs. We are about to enter Week 14, also known as the region semifinals. So in this week's edition, we'll look at the last week's games in the area around, talk about the teams that were eliminated, and we'll get to the three teams that are still playing this weekend, this Thanksgiving weekend, which is what everybody sets as a goal. If you can get to Thanksgiving, that's a big playoff goal. And then, of course, playing in December, which if these teams win this week, they will be doing that and will be 2 wins away from playing in the championship game at AT&T Stadium in Arlington. So we'll start with the teams that did not reach the third round. We'll start with a Class 2A Division I Region 2 game between San Saba and Collinsville. Collinsville lost that game 54-6. We talked about last week this was going to be a tough matchup for them because San Saba was undefeated. Collinsville was able to get to the second round on a last-second field goal block, but San Saba proved to be too much to hold down. It was 26-0 after the first quarter, and it was 54-6 at halftime, and that was pretty much the game, as they like to say. San Saba had over 500 yards offense, 368 of that was on the ground. The Collinsville touchdown was a 7-yard touchdown catch from Justin Hernandez, who caught that from Luis Hernandez. And Collinsville actually put up some good numbers offensively. They had over 300 yards of offense, but obviously San Saba was too high-powered. But all in all, a good first season for new head coach Garrett Patterson, going back to his alma mater. Was able to get them back in the playoffs after a rough start. They were able to get into the playoffs and not only get into the playoffs, but they upset Wolf City, who was 8-2 in the first round, and they finished with a 6-5 record. They'll have some key pieces on both sides of the ball that are going to be gone next year, but they do have some guys who contributed that will get even more improved roles next year. So realignment will be interesting to see with them. They have a situation where, depending on what the cutoff is, they could actually be dropping down to 2A Division 2. I believe that the number they turned in was 166, and I think that was like one over the cutoff between Division 1 and Division 2 last year. So if that number just moves even a little bit, there's a chance that they could drop down and not be in the district that they've been in the last couple of years with Tom Bean, Valley View. Of course, Valley View is moving up to 3A, but Trenton, Celeste, schools like that. So they may drop down. They could potentially replace Tioga, which will be moving up to Division 1. They could actually replace them in that district that has Munster, Cumbie, and Era right now. So that could be an interesting thing to watch here in a couple months for realignment. Another game from last week in 3A Division 1 Region 1. Again, another team coming off a first-round upset, trying to get a second one, but was unable to do so. Whitesboro ended up losing to Bushland 34-10. This was a game that was close at halftime. It was 14-3 Bushland, and then Whitesboro came out early in the third quarter. Tristan Gaines had a 48-yard touchdown catch from Cade Acker, and it's 14-10. And I'm sure Bushland is thinking, here we go, and I'm sure Whitesboro is thinking, here we go, after the Bearcats open the playoffs, knocking off a 9-1 Eastland team. They were able to keep it close, make some big plays, and then they were able to pull it out last week or 2 weeks ago. And unfortunately, last week Bushland was able to do just enough to pull away. So it's 14-10, and then Bushland got 2 more touchdowns in the third quarter to open it up and make it 27-10 going to the fourth quarter. And they added another touchdown on the first possession of the fourth quarter to make it 34-10. And obviously it's one of those things. Bushland's undefeated, is undefeated. and so that was going to be another tall order. But the Bearcats, like I said, this is another situation where you have a first-year head coach in Cody Fagan taking over a program that has continually made the playoffs. So you're going into a good situation. You want to not only maintain that and make it better. And again, they are a team that got off to a slow start, adjusting to some new things, some new schemes, some new just general concepts, dealing with some new coaches on the staff, especially with the head coach, and they were able to get things going during district. Move up and get third place, and like we said, they knocked off Eastland in one of the bigger first round upsets. And again, they're going to have some graduation situations. Obviously, quarterback Kate Ackers is a senior. Tristan Gaines, who's been their main receiver, is a senior. So there'll be some holes to fill, but they worked in some younger guys throughout the year. They're going to lose some guys on defense and on the offensive line as well. But again, a very good first introductory season for Coach Fagan to try to see what they had, maintain the success, and we'll see what realignment does with them. This is another situation where Whitesboro went out to Region 1 2 years ago and got stuck, in a district with some far-flung western schools, and that's why they're playing. Their two playoff games they had to play at Graham and at Iowa Park because they're playing teams that are so far out in West Texas, and it will be interesting to see. It looks like Van Alstyne, who we'll get to here in a second, will be moving up to Class 4A in the next realignment. So that could provide an opening to slide Whitesboro back into Region 2, keep them closer to home. They could slide right into that Pottsboro, Howe, Bonham, Lone Oak district, which would be really good for everybody. You get some of those rivalries back. In terms of that, and also just the travel would be so much better instead of having to play Brock and Bowie and some of those schools to the west. So they'll definitely be interested to see what happens with realignment, to see if it can pull them closer. We just mentioned them. Van Alstyne in a Class 3A Division 1 Region 2 matchup ended up losing to Gladewater 72-43. This was a game that did not really look like it was going to go this way. It was 30-7 at halftime, and then the teams exploded in the second half. Gladewater had the edge in the third quarter with a 28-22 margin there, and then both teams scored twice in the fourth quarter to kind of pack on the points there after halftime. But Gladewater was never really in trouble. Because they were up 30-7, and then they scored 3 touchdowns in the first 3 minutes of the third quarter to really blow that open. And Van Alstyne was trying to play from behind. The big thing there was Gladewater had 347 yards rushing. Eli Carter had 5 of those touchdowns in breaking that open. For Van Alstyne, Tim Rosenthal, he was 15 of 27 for 262 yards, and he threw 3 touchdown passes. All those touchdown passes went to Cam Montgomery, who had 7 catches for 168 yards. Draylon Davis added 5 catches for 75 yards. And in the running game, Jake Carroll had 15 carries for 145 yards and 2 scores. But unfortunately for the Panthers, they got the scoring going a little too late. Gladewater built up that big lead, and they advanced to the region final. So again, this is another really good season for a local team. Van Alstyne had been a continual playoff qualifier, but they just couldn't get past the first round. This was the first time since 2013 that they were able to do that, and unfortunately they just weren't able to get to the third round. But again, that's positive momentum. But again, as we keep saying, because the nature of high school football is you have years like this, and then it's who do you have to replace. Obviously, they're going to have some big losses on that offense. Top 2 receivers, Montgomery and Davis, were seniors. Rosenthal's a senior, and Jake Carroll, leading rusher, is a senior. So I would expect at the very least Jaden Mahan, the freshman running back who has got some pretty good playing time, he'll be the main ball carrier going forward next year. But they've got some holes to fill. They had some holes to fill this year when they lost the district MVP in Rhett Gallagher at quarterback, and they had some other spots on defense that they had to replace, and they were able to do that. That's the constant mark of a good program. A continual playoff participant. The big thing, like we mentioned with the situation with Whitesboro and realignment, they'll be watching to see for sure if Van Alstyne ends up moving up to Class 4A. The number that they turned in on snapshot day was above the cutoff between 4A and 3A last year. The question is going to be, how high does the UIL raise the bottom of 4A? And if they raise it enough, then Van Alstyne could stay down. But if they only raise it a little bit like they usually do, there's a really good chance that Van Alstyne is going to move up into Class 4A Division II for football, and then Class 4A across the board in the other sports. So that's definitely another thing that we're going to be watching the first week of February when realignment comes, to see what happens there. And honestly, we'll know with Van Alstyne, if they do go 4A, when the cutoffs come out, probably in about 2 or 3 weeks, the UAL will announce the cutoff between 6A and 5A, 5A and 4A, and the cutoffs in the divisions as well. So we'll know for sure if Van Alstyne does end up going up, and then it'll be a question of who do they get put with. I would imagine Farmersville, in the community, somebody in that, some people in that neighborhood. Those are some of the potential district opponents that you could see Van Alstyne in a district with, if that were to take place. Now we have the 3 teams that will be playing this Thanksgiving weekend. We'll start with the Class 3A Division I Region 2 semifinal between Pottsboro and Malakoff. This is a matchup of 12-0 Pottsboro against 11-1 Malakoff. Pottsboro won last week 47-35 against Sabine, and Malakoff won 53-41 against Jefferson. This is a rematch from the playoffs last year, although last year it was in the bi-district round. Malakoff won 63-35 on the way to a really good season for them last year. And so, unfortunately, Pottsboro had to mess with them in the first round a year ago. Pottsboro was coming off the 47-35 win against Sabine. This was a game that was close at times. I think the final score maybe is a little bit closer, because at one point, in the second half, Pottsboro was up 3 touchdowns. So it never really felt like in the second half that Sabine was in a real position to really threaten that lead. But it was a lot of offense for both sides. Pottsboro finished with 247 yards rushing and 215 passing, while Sabine had 119 rushing and 327 passing. So that's a situation that we may need to look at for this week because of the success that Sabine had. I'm sure Malakoff may have noticed that. Braden Plyler, he finished the game. He had 19 carries for 129 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was also 19 of 29 for 215 yards and a touchdown, while Cy Shope had 24 carries for 128 yards and 3 touchdowns. And Keaton Edelman chipped in a 52-yard fumble return for a score in the late in the third quarter. And that was a big momentum turn, because Sabine had just recovered an onside kick. They had kicked a field goal, and they went for the onside kick, and they had a chance to they're having a chance to cut into that lead even more, and that kind of erased that. So this has a chance, I think, to be a really high-scoring matchup. In the final regular season rankings, Malakoff was number 3, and Pottsboro was number 7. So you have two of the top 10 teams in the state matching up here. We mentioned Malakoff had a really good year last year. They were the state runner-up. They're trying to get to the region final for the third time in 4 years. Pottsboro's trying to get to the region final for the first time since 2016. The one loss that Malakoff does have was 14-13 against Grandview, who was ranked second in the final poll in the polls. They're not in the play. They lost in the first round, so that's that was Malakoff's only loss. So this is going to be a really good matchup. I think you could definitely see a shootout. I don't know. I don't think this is a low scoring game by any stretch of the imagination. I think they're pretty even. If you want to do a comparison by score, Malakoff closed out their district play with an 84-0 win over Kemp, and the next week that's who Pottsboro opened the playoffs with, and they beat them 63-0. So if you want to use just that as sort of a baseline, that's maybe a good comparison. And the winner will face either Winsboro or Gladewater in the region final. And I think this is a game. I didn't mention too. This is at 2 p.m. on Friday afternoon at Wiley ISD Stadium. And so it's that I always wonder on Thanksgiving weekend when you're not playing a Friday night game like you have been. You get in your routine and everybody plays it. Especially the small schools at 7:30 on a Friday. When you change things because of the holiday or because that's when a stadium is available because of a doubleheader or something along those lines, which team adjusts to that better? And we'll have another situation. We'll talk about that next with Gunner because they're playing in an afternoon game as well. Who adjusts better to that 2 p.m. Friday start time because you're kind of off of your rhythm that you've been in for a couple months. So that'll be interesting to see what happens there in what should be a really good matchup. We mentioned Gunner. They are taking on Rogers in a Class 3A Division II Region 2 semifinals matchup. This is at 2 p.m. on Friday at Corsicana. Both teams come in with 11-1 records. Gunner won last week 27-14 against Clifton, while Rogers won 46-14 against Jacksboro. This is a situation where you have a lot of interesting storylines. The least of the interesting storylines is this. Rogers' only loss was against Clifton, which we just mentioned. That was the team that Gunner beat last week 27-14. Clifton beat Rogers 27-21. So you have Gunner winning by 13 against Clifton. You have Rogers losing by 6 against Clifton. So is Gunner 3 touchdowns better than Rogers? That's what that would potentially tell you. The biggest story in terms of this matchup is the head coaching matchup. And the reason for that is because Rogers is led by Charlie Roten, who was the offensive coordinator at Gunner when they won the state championship in 2016, and a couple months later he gets the Rogers job, and this is his third year over there. So you have the man who installed the offense that has made Gunner so successful these last 4 years, winning a state championship, winning the region 3 years in a row, finishing as the state runner-up in 2017 and as a state semifinalist last year, and who knows how good things go this year. But he will be trying to stop them with that exact same offense. And that has gotten going at Rogers. They went 4-6 in his first year. They went 6-5 last year, and like we said, this year they're 11-1. So they've definitely trended in the right direction under Coach Roten. And so I was talking with Coach Fizell the other day for this preview, and it becomes this whole thing of, so you both run the same offense. Now, I'm sure maybe the terminology is even the same, but you kind of know what's coming. And so does it turn into, if you're Gunner, we know what Rogers is going to run, but do we outsmart ourselves? Do we outthink ourselves? And it's going to be the same thing for Rogers. Do you think they're going to do this? And because they know that you think that way, then they totally change it to try to catch you off guard. And so there's this great cat and mouse play call scenario that is going to play out, almost probably every drive, because you know what the other guy likes to run, and because you've been there and you've done that, and you know what their tendencies are, and down and distance, what play they would always call. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out because of that. And you just don't know if you just call the game like you normally would and not worry about that, and just assume that your team is better at executing it, as opposed to trying to outthink the other side. Now, I'll kind of outsmart yourself in the process. And so it'll be interesting there. Like we mentioned for last week, Gunner won 27-14. Peyton Lowe had 3 touchdowns in that game. He caught a pair of passes for 46 yards in the 2 scores, and he also had 12 carries for 116 yards and a touchdown. Clayton Reed added 15 carries for 107 yards, and this was a game that Gunner really had to kind of grind out. They ran for 250 yards, had over 300 yards total. But it was 27-7 at halftime, and Gunner kind of had to hold on there. They weren't able to keep that momentum going in the second half. And Clifton got within 2 scores with about 15 minutes to go in the game, but neither team really did much after that. Lowe also had 2 interceptions, and Gunner had to overcome 3 turnovers. So I'm sure that contributed to the fact that they weren't able to kind of pad that lead. But the Gunner defense has done what the Gunner defense continues to do on a yearly basis. They've won 10 games in a row since their only loss, which was to Pottsboro. So obviously that's not a bad loss because that's a team that is still playing in a higher division in 3A. And in that 10-game winning streak, they've only allowed more than 2 touchdowns once, and that was against City View in a game that they won at home. So the defense continues to do what they're going to do. It will be interesting to see what happens this week because of the matchup. And the winner will face Holiday or Lexington in the region final. I will point out, if it is Gunner that does advance, this will be a rematch either way for them from last year. Gunner beat Lexington on the way to the region final, and then they beat Holiday in the region final, and that was a rematch from the year before. So I'm sure Holiday is really sick of seeing Gunner, and I don't know if they're rooting for Rogers, but I'm sure that they don't want to see Gunner anymore. Besides losing to them in district play, they keep getting beaten out in the playoffs. But either way, that would be a rematch for Gunner either way. So it would be interesting to see how that would shake out. And again, this is a matchup, like we mentioned with the the Pottsboro Malakoff matchup in the final regular season rankings in Division 2, in 3A Division 2. Gunner was number 4 and Rogers was number 9. So again, I think if this has a chance to be a really close game, I feel like Gunner's probably the favorite just because when you're talking about a team that has won the region title 3 years in a row and is trying to get to the region final for the 5th time in 6 years, they are the team to beat until somebody beats them, and I think that's probably the way to look at it. But Rogers is definitely capable, and like I said, they have a guy who knows Gunner better than anybody that they could probably face. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out on Friday afternoon at 2 p.m. in Corsicana. And the last team that is still playing this week, I guess if compared to Pottsboro and Gunner's recent history, this is the Cinderella story for these playoffs. You have Bells taking on Paul Pewitt in a Class 3A Division 2 Region 3 semifinal. This game is at 6 p.m. Friday at Sulphur Springs. Bells comes in with a 9-3 record, and Paul Pewitt is 11-1. Bells is coming off a 14-6 win against Elysian Fields, while Paul Pewitt won 55-24 against Big Sandy Harmony. To touch on the win last week by Bells, it's pretty short and sweet because there was not a lot of action, and that's going to be an interesting thing that we're going to talk about after we go through the scores. It was the 14-6 win with 7-6 at halftime. Elysian Fields got on the board first in the second quarter, and Bells scored with 5 seconds to go in the half. So they were up 7-6, and then they added a touchdown with a couple minutes to go in the fourth quarter to at least get to a point where if Elysian Fields did tie it up, they would have to do so with a touchdown and a 2-point conversion. Wrangler Priest had 23 carries for 159 yards and both touchdown runs. Bo Baker added 16 carries for 47 yards, and this was a true grind-em-out game. Bells had 52 carries for 210 yards, They completed one pass for 9 yards, so they only had 219 yards total. Elysian Fields wasn't much better. They had 31 carries for 118 yards. They did throw for 173 yards. So they finished a little under 300 yards, but it wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. And we talked about it was a defensive struggle, and that's a really good sign for Bells because Elysian Fields the week before had scored 74 points. They won a game 74-50, and so I'm sure they were feeling like they could score on anybody. And basically outside of that one drive, Elysian Fields didn't do a whole heck of a lot against Bells, and that's another good sign for Bells because they opened the playoffs with kind of a shootout win, 36-32 against Winona. So they've shown they can play different styles. If it's a matching score for score game, they've shown they can do that. And also if it's going to be a grind them out, low scoring game, they've done that. And just as overall in this season, they've had so many close games. I believe they've had 6 or 7 games have been decided by a single possession. So they know the pressure will not get to them. This is not a situation where a team has been blowing teams out all year and they've never had that drive in the fourth quarter where we have to get first downs, we have to run out the clock, we have to go score a touchdown. Type of team. They've been in all these close games. They've won some, they've lost some, so that they've seen both sides of it. But they've been in enough of them that if this is a shootout, which I have a feeling it might be, that they can handle that. And if somehow it turns into the game that they had last week, I think they can handle that as well. The interesting thing about this matchup is both teams run the slot T offense, and that's one just because the slot T is very rare in today's world of the spread and throwing the ball and that sort of thing. The fact that both of these teams are doing this out of their base as their base offense is kind of rare that they would meet up in the playoffs. I was joking with Coach West when I talked to him to preview this game, and this is a 6 o'clock start, and he said this game might be over by 7:15. And I don't know how much he was kidding about that because I bet you combined, these teams probably don't throw more than 6 passes in this game. I mean, this has the potential to be a really fast game, and it's going to be interesting. And as Coach West said, it's basically going to come down to who's going to find a way to get maybe a stop or a couple stops, because both teams have shown they're really good at running this offense. Bells has gotten so much better as the season's gone on. They've won 8 games in a row. As they've kind of hit their stride in kind of running this offense. But Pewett's really good. Last week in the win against Big Sandy Harmony, they had 5 guys run for 100 yards or more. And so that's going to be the issue. The issue is basically going to be if you're Bells, you have 2 guys right now that are probably the main guys in Priest and Baker. And then the question is, can you get some production out of some of these other backs, whether it's quarterback Blake Rowland or the other backs in Grady Waldrop and Condor Morris. If you can get something out of them in addition to what you expect out of Priest and Baker, I think you've got a really good shot, because I don't know if you can rely on one guy getting 35 carries and making the difference when they've got just in the regular season they had one guy run for 1,500 yards, another guy run for 900 yards, another guy run for 900 yards, and then 2 other guys run for almost 700 yards. I mean, that's a lot of yardage, and you can rest guys, and you don't get that drop-off. And so that could be a situation where the backfield depth of Pewett might be the difference. Their only loss came in district play against Dangerfield, 42-38, and that is an interesting fact because the winner of this game will be facing the Newton Dangerfield winner in the region final. So you could have an all-district 11-2A matchup, 11-3A matchup in Pewett and Dangerfield. And of course, if Dangerfield does not advance, it's because the 2-time defending champ Newton is trying to win the region again. So if you want to see a continuation of that underdog story, having Bells going up against the 2-time defending champs in the 4th round for a spot in the state semifinals would be truly that. We've mentioned kind of all year long Bells is doing things that they haven't done. If they win this game, they will be in the region final / state quarterfinals for the first time ever. And just being here, this is the second time in school history that they've even made the region semifinals. The last time was in 1989. They're on an 8-game winning streak. It's the longest since the 96 team won their first 11 games, and it's only the third time in school history that a Bells team has won at least 8 games in a row. And the 9 wins that they have already is tied for the third most in school history. The 89 and the 96 teams won 10 games and 11 games. So those are the only teams in school history that have won more than this season for the Panthers. So again, it's already been a great season. No matter what happens, this group is the first group that's won more than one playoff game in a season. They've won the 2 this year. As we mentioned before, the 89 team actually didn't win a playoff game. They had a first round bye, and then they advanced on a tie via penetration. So this group is doing a lot of things for the first time, or a lot of things that have been done for the first time in at least at minimum 20 years. To go back to 96 is really the point that you have to go back to for a lot of the success that the Panthers are having. And honestly, I mean, this is the sort of game where I could see it. I could see it kind of going either way, just because Bells has all the confidence in the world. They have every reason to think that they can pull this off. And like I said, you have 2 offenses going against each other, which is interesting. So we will see what happens with all 3 of these matchups. Again, I think they're all really good matchups. I think you could convince me that all 3 of our local teams win. I think you could convince me all 3 of the local teams lose. And I think you could see any combination of wins or losses between the 3, just because you get to this point in the year, and like we mentioned, you have 12-0 versus 11-1, 11-1 versus 11-1, and 9-3 versus 11-1. Everybody is good at this point, and usually the games are always close. And because these are the best teams, as the saying goes, there are no turkeys after Thanksgiving. And so we'll see what happens on Friday. At the very least, we will have a little bit of a recap on these 3 teams if nobody does advance. But we'll keep this going as long as at least one team advances. So there will be at least one next week, and we'll see if we have anybody to talk about playing in the region final. Hopefully all 3 of them advance, kind of keep this thing going into December. So thanks for listening. I hope everybody has a happy Thanksgiving. If you want to listen on your way to or from your destination on Thursday, feel free. And we'll check you, and hopefully you'll check it out next week. Thanks a lot.